This video has the following content warnings. If you grew up in the 2000s or early 2010s, chances are you were sitting in your middle school's home economics class one day and your teacher pulled out a DVD for a movie showcasing a man with fries in his mouth. You watched it over the course of a class period or two and walked away from it, maybe not learning anything you didn't already know in the broad strokes, but you might have thought about it for a little bit. Not to any meaningful extent, though. You're only 12 years old after all. A majority of your time at school was probably spent wishing you could go home to play Kingdom Hearts 2 and listen to Sum 41.
We totally owned you, lamers.
Besides, even though that movie criticized fast food, the way fast food businesses have operated is kind of all you've ever known, and it isn't like it made an overwhelmingly compelling case for how things ought to be changed. If you even paid enough attention, your biggest takeaway was to occasionally say no when you're asked, "Do you want fries with that?" Oh well. At least now you know enough to the point where you're confident that you won't end up like the man with fries in his mouth. Super Size Me is a 2004 documentary film created by Morgan Spurlock in which he uses an at-the-time court case against the McDonald's Corporation as a springboard for an experiment. What if he ate McDonald's every day for a month? He does, his health suffers, and then the movie ends. That's putting it very simply. There are several short segments that veer off into other topics over the course of the film, and when the experiment is being focused on, we don't just watch Spurlock eat food and nothing else. We see him go to his doctors, do weigh-ins, and take blood tests consistently, which helps balance all of the other content in the film, and if nothing else, it keeps the pacing consistent. While Super Size Me was immensely successful at the time it was released, grossing millions of dollars off of its budget of less than $100,000, and even getting nominated for the Best Documentary category at the 77th Oscars, over the 17 years since its publishing, the documentary has drawn a significant amount of ire from multiple factors, such as its framing and the numerous errors made during the experiment, as well as the no-shit Sherlock jokes making fun of the movie for taking so much time to hammer home a pretty obvious message, like this widely shared Letterboxd review. I have a kind of weird relationship to the movie myself. I had to watch it 4 times over the course of my education, once in middle school, twice in high school, and once in university. Over the course of those mandatory rewatches, I found I disliked the documentary more as time went on. Not just because I had some spite built up from having to do the same assignment 4 times over the course of 9 years, although that was definitely a small factor. I genuinely found that the movie was aging very poorly, so that's what we're going to cover today. We're looking at the rise of fast food, how Super Size Me fails in so many ways, a couple of related films that came out a few years later, and the sequel from the late 2010s. Yeah, it's a lot more dense than why I think Frozen 2 is bad, right?
I'm ready.
I'm not going to go extremely in-depth for the sake of time, but I do want to cover the rise of the fast food industry, and McDonald's in particular. Super Size Me makes a couple of statements about the reach of the corporation, but it mainly focuses on the United States, so while I'll also touch on how McDonald's overseas accomplishments were a mark of how successful the business had become, we're going to explore how the rise of the fast food industry in the US was uniquely American. And by American, I mean being inextricably linked with systems that disadvantaged people of lower economic class and non-white skin color. Because while the expansion of McDonald's did occur because a franchisor had a very good eye for placing restaurants, it also hinged on the mobility of its founders and that they could move from the East to the West in 1930 to begin with without fear of discrimination because they were white, from New Hampshire, and not poor. After a couple of failed attempts at establishing themselves in California, which included opening a movie theater near Hollywood, the McDonald's brothers opened what would become known as the first McDonald's in San Bernardino in 1940. And while there is no proof that McDonald's started out as a segregated establishment, the business and fast food as a whole would go on to enjoy benefits that manifested the way they did because of systemic race and class inequality. Not everyone could enjoy the spoils that came from the post-war economy after World War II. The highways that came about due to the Federal Highway Act of 1956 could let customers more conveniently access their favorite restaurants, but they also reinforced segregationist housing. McDonald's and the fast food industry, like the film industry decades before, showed both how a business can be born, gain massive amounts of capital and influence, and reflect the systemic inequalities of the 20th century. Even removed from those things, McDonald's rise to prominence might seem meteoric, but it wasn't necessarily smooth. There was huge competition in the 50s when franchising began because other restaurants wanted a piece of the pie and rivalry was fierce. Ray Kroc did not allow his restaurants to include the Filet-O-Fish on the menu, and only changed his mind when establishments in the Ohio area started losing money for religious reasons. And initially, French fries weren't really a viable option to sell on a large scale until a pre-preparing technique was created. Bumps on the path to growth were numerous and varied, and successes came from business decisions that understood the need to adapt and create attractive qualities, both in the food and in the distinctiveness of the Golden Arch architecture. These qualities would also have large appeal overseas. The rise to national and global prominence was perhaps most keenly felt by the massive successes of the openings for the Moscow and Beijing locations, and by the 21st century, McDonald's is a massive corporation with tens of thousands of restaurants around the world, and fast food is a humongous business. So, supersize me. Before tearing into this documentary, I will be fair and say that while I do have problems with the content of the movie, it's not difficult to get through at all. The documentary ends in 90 minutes and balances the main experiment's content with the side segments quite well. Even though it hasn't aged well, I didn't have any trouble getting through it, which I can't say for every documentary. Looking at the content of the movie itself is where I start having more problems, so I guess we'll get into them. What's perhaps the most obvious issue is the staggering amount of fat phobia that's present from basically the first minute. Heavier people are either condescended to in the voiceover,
The biggest people. Congratulations.
dehumanized in shots like this that remove their heads while framing their bodies as unattractive because they're also set to this accompanying music, or sometimes both.
Walking has become such a chore that we rely on machines to do it for us.
There are also caricatures like this that occasionally show up that accomplish the same sentiment, complete with goofy sound effects that play when they move. This strikes me as odd looking back, because there's a small segment where a teenager talks for about a minute on how difficult it can be to feel like you aren't perfectly matching supermodels at all times. Something that I imagine has only gotten worse for young people in the decade and a half plus since this movie's release. But whether intentional or not, it's contrasted with the body shaming that the obesity epidemic often defaulted to. So even though this segment leans sympathetic, it's really undercut by the body shaming juxtaposition, and it drags the movie down as a result. On my most recent rewatch, I was really struck by the feeling that the caricatures didn't need to be here, presented like this. I don't doubt that there was a better way to present a not insignificant portion of these, because, come on. Like, body shaming sucks. Speaking of dragging the end product down, while the content of the movie is balanced well enough and goes at a consistent pace, the extreme shortness of some of the side segments do get a bit distracting, because the best of them feel like Spurlock could have just made a much more interesting documentary about that segment instead of his experiment. So when you do cut back to the experiment after a couple of minutes, it unintentionally reveals how Morgan eating McDonald's for 30 days is one of the least engaging aspects of the whole thing. Now, for the record, not all of the segments complement the movie well. You could cut Don Gorski out of the movie completely, and the film would be better for it. Like, does the guy who ate 19,000 Big Macs really add anything? Well, I guess he does provide a bit of levity, so there's that.
I always make fun of people at work, saying, I'm gaining weight. I said, well, you should try the Gorski diet. And I said, oh, yeah.
This isn't the only way Super Size Me has aged poorly, though. There are smaller details that have since been eroded by time, like the statistic that 50% of America isn't connected to the internet, and Jared Fogle still being in it at all because it was 2004. Then there's the ending, where it's essentially said that individual choice is what's going to account for massive problems caused by corporations. It's a fool's errand of a case to make because the scale of any large problem brought up, especially if you add perspective to it like this documentary does, is impossible to resolve just by choosing a healthier menu item. Now, to be fair, it's not like the movie is completely unaware of this. It at least does understand that a massive industry is willing to operate at the expense of its customers.
Their loyalty isn't to you, it's to the stockholders. The bottom line, they're a business, no matter what they say.
At my most generous, a case could be made that the unethicality of corporations pursuing profit over people was a conversation that wasn't being had as much during the Bush administration, given that the financial crash of 2008 was yet to happen, But coming down on individual choice being the film's thesis is one of those decisions that I'm sure aided in the movie's accessibility in 2004 that has just not held up to time, or even to scrutiny in light of the McDonald's Corporation later admitting to having participated in much more significant crime than including a supersize option, like, for example, slave labor. Then there's the experiment itself. Okay. So, at the beginning of Super Size Me, Spurlock goes to 3 doctors to get checkups so that he can compare his health before and after his experiment. While being asked questions about his health, he gets asked this.
Any alcohol use?
Now, none.
And this answer isn't true. Spurlock admitted in a social media post in late 2017 that among other worse things, he had previously undisclosed problems with alcoholism, and while he is, to my knowledge, sober as I write this script, he heavily implies that he drank regularly during the filming of the experiment, which brings certain moments of the film into new light. Moments like Morgan vomiting in a parking lot, having liver problems and heart palpitations. Heavy usage of alcohol is likely a factor as to why his results and problems during filming were so extreme. If you've ever heard of cases where people attempt and fail to replicate this experiment's results, this is one of the few reasons why. Combined with Morgan switching from a vegan diet to a fast food one, and another one we'll get to in a minute. While we should obviously understand and acknowledge the seriousness of alcoholism, as well as how difficult it is to struggle with, that it was likely present and acted upon during filming unfortunately means that the experiment is a compromised one. To sum it up, many mistakes were made that leaves Super Size Me as a relic of the early 2000s, built on compromised science, of its time fat phobia, and lack of understanding of systemic problems. It's something you should only check out if you ever want to look back at how far our understanding of the fast food industry and body diversity has come, or if you are, for no other reason, curious. I could honestly end here, but there are a few more documentaries I want to talk about. And while I hope that I've sufficiently explained why I think Super Size Me is pretty bad for numerous reasons, let's just say it could have been far, far worse. Fathead is a 2009 response documentary created by alleged comedian Tom Naughton. It criticizes Super Size Me in numerous ways that I already have during this video, like the regular fat phobia and the errors made during the experiment. In a way, it could be considered a response to not just Super Size Me, but much of the fat phobia of the early 2000s. And despite this, it is probably my least favorite documentary I have ever seen. From the outset, Fathead puts me in a really weird place because I'm going to be effectively going up to bat for another documentary I just spent about 5 minutes critiquing and also hate, and it will probably feel like mood whiplash to a degree, but it really can't be exaggerated how much worse Fathead is as a piece of work in almost, if not every aspect. Problems are across the board, but I'm going to do my best. So, let's continue to fall down the rabbit hole together. What's one of the most immediate problems, besides the production value, is the way Fathead uses a disingenuous level of literalism or anecdotes to respond to claims made by Super Size Me. It isn't difficult to criticize multiple aspects of that movie, but responding to how the frequency of fast food establishments around America shows the dominance of the brands in everyday life for millions of people by literally standing outside a restaurant waiting for a stranger to drag you inside is really weird.
No baloney conclusion. Nobody forces anyone to eat fast food.
Like, it's framed as a cool debunk, but it feels more like a failed attempt at humor. This isn't the only time it happens either. For example, discussions of how relentless advertising socializes brand loyalty from children at a young age is responded to by Naughton's mother, basically saying that tons of ads are no match for one stingy parent, not at all discussing how a brand-loyal child might stay loyal despite that, considering there's more than one actor at play. This probably wouldn't bother me so much if this stuff wasn't interspersed with an occasionally cogent critique. Like how Spurlock ate in excess of what was recommended, thousands of calories more than he needed to during his experiment, which was another contributing factor to his extreme results. I'm not saying that isn't negligent, it absolutely is, but following that, Naughton also uses that as an in to criticize the film for its political motivation, in particular his heavy criticism of McDonald's. which is a strange thing to criticize Super Size Me for, because I don't think it's at all a stretch to say that Fathead is more politically motivated. Its priorities are just in a different place. So, going after Super Size Me for that at all comes off as a weirdly patronizing argument. A real pot calling the kettle black sort of deal. It becomes pretty clear as you keep watching that defending the fast food industry is one of Fathead's main priorities. Where it continues to fall apart is how it has to deliberately ignore arguments made by Super Size Me in order to make its points stronger. There's no mention of how much McDonald's, Pepsi, and Hershey spend on advertising in order to make health organizations appear as much more of an encroaching force, despite Super Size Me bringing up how health organizations are dwarfed in their budgets. Similarly, Fathead doesn't really discuss how Super Size Me also took a few minutes to focus on underfunded school PE programs, because framing all of Spurlock's critiques as criticisms of McDonald's makes for a much stronger argument. Despite not bringing up these segments, Fathead somehow manages to be 15 minutes longer than Super Size Me. This extra time is spent advocating for the paleo diet. And while it's good for Naughton that he lost 12 pounds from this experiment, the documentary has to dance around the fact that the meat industry is one of the largest environmental polluters in all of food production. So, the movie frames this diet as a better weight loss solution for everyone by juxtaposing the amount of time it took Spurlock to lose the weight he'd gained from his experiment. And look, if you're a viewer that has been looking to lose weight before and lost it through paleo, then that's super excellent, and I'm genuinely happy for you. But framing this diet as the quintessential weight loss solution for everyone can only feel realistic in the long term if you ignore any information on the current environmental cost. For being a response documentary to Super Size Me, Fathead very clumsily makes the same error by taking an identical cut-and-dry approach to critiquing an influential power structure and falling on individual choice being the answer to that power structure providing bad or insufficient nutrition information. Except this time, it's in total defense of the fast food industry. We've already covered how poor of an argument this is to make, but it's less excusable in Fathead because of how it uses vaguely progressive phrasing to say that corporations shouldn't have an obligation to provide better or more accessible nutrition info. It says that if a corporation operates at the expense of its consumers, it's the individual's responsibility to account for them, and the business's success is indicative of its quality and everything is fine actually. But if the government has provided subsidization or misinformation that worked to drive the obesity epidemic, then hold no quarter in your criticism. It's a weird and contradictory double standard, not helped at all by the strange truther undercurrent throughout the whole thing, which also manages to be brought down because two of the documentary's interviewees, literally the first two named in the credits, are from a foundation that spreads health misinformation. Which also means that anything Fathead argues about nutrition at all should be handled with a massive grain of salt at best because they could just be outright lying.
This was all being pushed by people that Americans trusted.
Guess what, viewer? You've been lied to. Now sit back, relax, and don't question why one of my sources recommends feeding infant children raw milk on their website. Then again, Fathead was published in 2009, and that milk article was published in 2015. I wonder what the Weston A. Price Foundation has been getting up to in the last year or so. Okay, so in this podcast transcript on COVID-19 vaccines, they've said that accommodating the virus is an overreaction, actually, that it's harmless, and that natural herd immunity is what's really going to stop the virus instead of getting the vaccine. That's a very dangerous thing to say. Who did this? Dr. Bob Sears. I've never heard of that guy. Let me Google him. Robert William Sears, known as Dr. Bob, is an American pediatrician noted for his unorthodox and dangerous views on childhood vaccination. Oh my god, Tom, this foundation is one of your sources? The point here is that both corporations and the government can be responsible for disseminating bad or insufficient health information to the public. But if failing your fast food experiment by deliberately overeating is negligent, using a few valid arguments in the service of a documentary built on bad science and in defense of corporation unethicality is downright reprehensible. I could talk for much longer on why Fathead is a much worse experience than Super Size Me, such as its weird and honestly pretty insulting misunderstanding of how addiction works, its lopsided pacing, and numerous failed attempts at humor that makes watching the film much more of a chore than it ought to be. But at the end of the day, Fathead is just a truly dreadful experience that I can't in good faith recommend to anyone, even as a joke. It just sucks. What else did I watch? I also watched the 2007 documentary Super High Me, which...
My name is Doug Benson, and I am super high.
Okay, I enjoyed this one, I think, but it isn't really relevant to the topic. I remember being aware of it in the early 2010s, which is also the same time I first learned about Fathead, now that I think about it. So I guess I just finally found an excuse to watch it. Of all of the criticisms I had of Super Size Me while I was doing my rewatch for this video, the one where Spurlock could have made a much more interesting documentary out of a number of topics wasn't a damning one, but it was definitely one of the things I was thinking about the most before I started writing. So going into Super Size Me 2, I wasn't sure what to expect. The documentary was released in 2017 and is overall better than the first one, although I still do have a couple of issues. Instead of being an eating challenge, Morgan takes a look at the chicken industry. He opens a restaurant and looks at what the standards are for production, so I guess Super Size Me is just a brand recognition title now. Alright. On one hand, the film is an improvement over the first in numerous ways. There is sharper focus on a more compelling topic, the fat phobia is gone, and a systemic critique is made of how a big industry operates at the expense of its workers without falling on individual choice being the solution. In particular, the documentary sympathizes with chicken farmers that get overworked by the system and end up in millions of dollars of debt. A few minutes are also taken to sympathize with fast food workers too. Improvements were definitely made on this front. On the other hand, the film's ending leaves me incredibly mixed. Spurlock's restaurant opens, and he puts factoids about how the chicken industry works with all of the unsettling details around the establishment free for the customers to read. They're put off by it, so his mission of getting the truth out there is successful, I think. Anyway, the film ends with Spurlock saying this.
And I'm gonna open more of these, and in time, I might just put you and me out of business.
Like, it's framed as a much more positive ending than the first film, but if Spurlock says he's planning on making more of these restaurants when we've taken an hour and a half to see how deeply flawed the status quo of chicken production is, both to the treatment of the chickens and the workers, especially the workers, ending on this note feels incongruent when compared to the other, more somber moments of the film. Then again, this is how the film opened too, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the documentary is operating and functioning under the status quo while attempting to come off as earth-shatteringly groundbreaking is just not very good. So, I guess we're done here. Now, it's worth noting that while Super Size Me and its legacy was instrumental for getting tons of people introduced to the fast food industry's inner workings, this entire discussion expands far beyond Morgan Spurlock. And in recent years, an increasing level of attention has been brought to expanding the rights of fast food workers, as well as empathizing with their struggles. So before I end, I'm going to recommend the book We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. It's got some really illuminating reports on how fast food employees are treated around the world, as well as covering things that I didn't discuss in this video, like workplace safety. If you don't have the time to check out a book, but would like to learn more about the current state of fat phobia, then I also highly recommend the You're Wrong About podcast episode on the obesity epidemic, which is how I learned about fat phobic framing in video. It was very helpful for giving me some perspective on the whole ordeal before I started writing. For example, the reason why I refrained from giving dietary advice myself in this video is because while you might feel compelled to promote the diet that worked for you to other people, the reality is that outside of very general nutrition, everyone's body is different, and what worked for you may not work for whomever you're recommending your diet to. If anything can be understood from the current state of things, it's that we've got at least a better frame of reference than we did in 2004, that we have more sympathy, or at least more visible and accessible sympathy, to combat existing condescension to both fat phobia and food industry worker struggle, is a positive that I think is reflected in Super Size Me too, which, to call back to way earlier, is something we likely have a far easier time getting behind due to the 2008 recession as well as today's growing inequality. While it's better that 2 sympathized with various industry workers compared to the complete nothing that was the first film and Fathead, we should also acknowledge how workers' rights can be expanded through direct action and holding unethical practices to account. And that's not just in... Is it raining now? At the end of the video? Right in front of my salad? Oh, I think it stopped. Okay, I gotta record this quick. And that's not just in food service, that's also in things like tech manufacturing and entertainment. One of the first steps towards that is understanding the struggles of others and having sympathy, because most of us are in this struggle together in one form or another. So, oh, I think it's raining again. I have like a thing written here, but before the rain starts, just take the Bill and Ted quote.
Be excellent to each other.
And support unions.